And we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and came unto them to Troas in 5 days, where we abode 7 days. And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight. And there were many lights in the upper chamber where they were gathered together. And there sat in a window a certain young man named Eutychus, being fallen into a deep sleep. And as Paul was long preaching, he sunk down with sleep, and fell down from the third loft, and was taken up dead. And Paul went down and fell on him, and embracing him said, Trouble not yourselves, for his life is in him. When he therefore was come up again, and had broken bread, and eaten, and talked a long while, even till the break of day, so he departed. And they brought the young man alive, and were not a little comforted. So far in this series, we've covered the keeping of the Passover in both the Old and New Testaments, and looked at the word Easter in Acts 12:4 in the 1611 King James Version. Much to my surprise, study has shown that the word Easter was originally a word used by German Anglo-Saxon Christians to refer to the Hebrew Pesach, what we now call Passover. It was a bit crazy to me when I discovered this. I remember sitting at my computer the first time I was reading the history about this and just shaking my head. A word that is today a reference to a Christian holiday separate from Passover was originally a synonym for the Passover. Don't miss, though, that this proves that the only use of the word Easter in the King James Bible is a reference to Passover. This means we have no reference to Easter Sunday anywhere in the Bible. Today I would like to begin looking at the actual Christian holiday of Easter Sunday. When did this begin? Is there any evidence in the New Testament that the earliest Christians celebrated an annual holiday on a first day of the week, commemorating the resurrection of the Messiah? You know, I realize that Easter Sunday is a huge deal in Christianity today, and I will show in a future lesson that such practice does originate in the 2nd century AD. But even this early evidence for some type of an Easter Sunday is about 100 years removed from the time of Yeshua. It is not found in Scripture, but it rather developed over the first 100 years of the Christian faith in some Christian communities. The earliest Christians may have commemorated Yeshua's resurrection on a first day of the week, but I believe such a commemoration was originally on Wave Sheaf Day or First Fruits Day, a day that always came after the Sabbath and was tied to Yahweh's holy days in Leviticus 23. I can't tell you how many times Christians have found out that I don't celebrate Easter Sunday, and they immediately reply, "You don't believe in the resurrection?" I then get to explain the day of first fruits during the Feast of Unleavened Bread as the day I commemorate Yeshua's resurrection, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Seeing that I can't find anything in the New Testament about Easter Sunday, I decided to open today's lesson with Acts 20:6-12, a text that speaks of Apostle Paul fellowshipping with the Christians in Troas, and a text that many in Christianity have used as proof for a regular, reoccurring weekly church service on the first day of the week. This particular first day of the week happened in the springtime of the year, shortly after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We know this because Acts 20:6 mentions the days of unleavened bread, then Acts 20:7 mentions the first day of the week. I think Acts 20:7 is probably the best text someone has for showing something resembling Easter Sunday in the Bible. However, I believe it falls short from proving anything about Easter Sunday, and I also believe it falls short in proving a regular, reoccurring weekly first day church service. We'll begin in verse 6. And we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and came unto them to Troas in 5 days, where we abode 7 days. Luke, the author of the book of Acts, writes, "We," Luke and Paul, "sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread." According to Hebrew Scripture, the days of unleavened bread take place in the month or moon of Abib, which is the first month of the Hebrew calendar around the time of the spring equinox. It's the month we are currently in as I'm teaching this lesson originally. Leviticus 23, 5-8 tells us that Yahweh's Passover takes place on the 14th day of the first month, Bein HaErabim, between the evenings. And then on the 15th day of the first month, we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days, from Abib 15 through Abib 21. In Acts 20 and 6, Luke and Paul sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. This could have been as early as Abib 22, but we are not specifically told that it was the day immediately after the feast week. I assume from reading the text that Paul spoke of shortly after the days of unleavened bread, but the text just says after, not one day after. I'm going to put forth to you a scenario using one day after as a starting point, but we cannot be dogmatic on this. So on the chart, we have the month of Abib and early Zeph, the second month, with Passover, the 14th, in yellow, and the days of unleavened bread, 15th through 21st, in red. At the earliest, Paul sailed away from Philippi on the 22nd of Abib, and then came to Troas in 5 days, placing his arrival in Troas on Abib 26th. Acts 20 and 6 then tells us that Paul and Luke stayed in Troas for 7 days, which could be counted from Abib 26th, their arrival, to Zeph 2nd, if Abib had 30 days that year. This would place Paul's fellowship on the evening as the new moon ended, and then he would have left at dawn the morning of Zeph 2nd. Acts 20 verse 11. Once again, this is speculation. I believe that it is educated speculation, but I must admit that the text is not this detailed. My main point here is to show that at the earliest, the account recorded in Acts 20, 7-12 took place at the beginning of the second month on the Hebrew calendar. While my counting of days is speculation, my assertion that this was early second month is not speculation, because this is the earliest that Acts 20 and 7 could have occurred. Now, it could have occurred later in the second month, but the days specified in Acts 20 and 6 make it no earlier than the beginning second month. You may ask why this is significant. Well, let's look at the next verse. And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight. Notice on the screen that it was the first day of the week, but it was the night portion, after New Moon Day, that this gathering could have taken place. The phrase first day of the week, or in Greek, mia ton sabbaton, is one that is much debated in Torah-keeping circles. Many Torah keepers claim that the phrase is mistranslated in the King James Bible and should say something like first of the Sabbaths or one of the Sabbaths. They claim that Acts 20 and 7 actually took place on a Sabbath and not on the first day of the week. I do not agree with that understanding. I believe the King James Bible is correct in saying the first day of the week. I believe it's a reference to the day after the Sabbath. William Tyndale, in his 1526 New Testament, translates Acts 20 and 7 as, and on the morrow after the Sabbath day. And John Wycliffe, translating in the late 1300s, gives the phrase as, and in the first day of the week. Modern-day scholarly translations like the Revised Standard Version, New American Standard Bible, English Standard Version, and Lexham English Bible all translate the phrase as first day of the week as well. So why do many Torah keepers try to say the phrase is mistranslated? The claim begins by looking at the Greek word behind week, sabbaton. The Greek word sabbaton is often translated as Sabbath in the King James Bible, but is additionally translated as week in certain New Testament passages. And I've heard Torah keepers say that week is a mistranslation because the Greek word Sabbaton is most often translated as Sabbath in the King James Bible. The problem they have is not recognizing that the word carries more than one meaning, depending upon the context. Sabbaton can refer to a Sabbath day or the interval between two Sabbaths, a week. In other words, the first day of the week is one to the Sabbath, mia, one, ton, to the or of the, Sabbaton, Sabbath. The second day of the week is two to the Sabbath, and so on. Nowhere in Scripture do the Hebrews assign any names to the days of the week, except for the Sabbath and Preparation Day. The rest are named by number. Strong's Concordance gives part of the definition of Sabbaton as the interval between two Sabbaths. Thayer's lexicon gives this under the number 2 definition of Sabbaton, 7 days a week. Both Strong's and Thayer's list the Sabbath or Sabbaths as the primary definition of Sabbaton, but they list the entire week as the secondary definition or use of Sabbaton. Mr. Thayer gives Mark 16:2 and Luke 18:12 as 2 examples of this secondary use, and I'd like to look at both of them. First, Mark 16:1-2. And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome had bought sweet spices, that they might come and anoint him. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. The phrase first day of the week here in Mark 16:2 is the same phrase in Acts 20:7. Notice here that this day comes when the Sabbath was past, verse 1. It makes no sense to translate the phrase in verse 2 as first of the Sabbaths, a Sabbath day, if the Sabbath had just passed. It was rather one to the Sabbath, or day one to the Sabbath. Here in Mark 16:1-2, we have both uses of the Greek word Sabbaton in play. In verse 1, it is translated as Sabbath, seeing that Mark 15:42, a few verses before, mentions Preparation Day and calls it the day before the Sabbath, when Yeshua was crucified. Then in verse 2, Sabbaton is translated as week, and very early on the first day of the week, since the Sabbath day had just passed, verse 1. Now, a common reply from many Torah keepers is that first of the Sabbaths is a better translation in Mark 16:2 because it references the first day in counting the 7 Sabbaths to Pentecost. Now, I do not disagree that this particular day is the first day in counting the Sabbaths to Pentecost, being the morrow after the first day of unleavened bread. But notice that this still references the first day of the week. In other words, the first day in counting the Sabbaths to Pentecost is the first day of a week. It's not a Sabbath day. Now transfer this understanding back to Acts 20:7, which contains the same phrase. Remember I told you the calendar calculation was important in Acts 20? Well, Acts 20:7 could not be the first day in counting the Sabbaths to Pentecost, because I've shown how the earliest Acts 20:7 could have taken place was early second moon. Early in the second moon or a month is too late for the first day in counting the Sabbaths to Pentecost. The counting of the 7 Sabbaths complete begins in the first month, not the second month. Now, some do say that the phrase should be one of the Sabbaths in Acts 20, verse 7, recognizing that the Greek word mia in miaton sabbaton can be translated as either one or first. Both translations are legitimate. But I still think that comparing Acts 20:7 with Mark 16:2 shows that the phrase miaton sabbaton is better understood as one to the Sabbath, or first day of the week. Furthermore, let's not forget Mr. Thayer's other citation of this use of Sabbaton in the Greek New Testament, Luke 18 and 12. We'll begin reading at verse 11 to get a little context. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. This is Yeshua's parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector praying to the Father. One of the things the Pharisee mentions in his prayer is, I fast twice in the week. The word week here is Sabbaton, same word as in Mark 16:2 and Acts 20 and 7. Now surely the Pharisee isn't saying, I fast twice in or on the Sabbath. That's nothing to brag about, and really it makes no sense. Is the Pharisee perhaps saying, I fast twice in the Sabbaths? That is, the 7 Sabbaths counting to Pentecost? That's not much fasting to be bragging about 2 out of 49 days. What makes the most sense is exactly how our English Bibles translate it. The Pharisee was bragging about fasting 2 days out of the week. That is, 2 days out of 7. The word Sabbaton here is used in its secondary sense of the interval between 2 Sabbaths. I believe the best way to understand Acts 20 and 7 is the first day of the week. If we can prove that a particular translation is not best or accurate by comparing it to other scholarly, legitimate Bible translations, that's one thing. But to just up and claim a bogus translation based on halfway looking at Strong's Concordance, that's not being honest with the text. What we have here in Acts 20 is a first day of the week gathering, shortly after the days of unleavened bread. This is too far away from what will be called Easter Sunday, or in early centuries, Christian Pascha. If you recall in part 2 of this series, I mentioned how some Christians in the 2nd century AD began keeping Pascha or Passover on the Sunday that came after the 14th day of Abib. Acts 20 and 7 is too far removed from that date, being in the 2nd moon, not the 1st moon. So Acts 20 and 7 does not fit the Christian Easter Sunday model. But I don't believe it fits a Sunday model or first day model in general either. What I'll begin arguing for in my next lesson is that Acts 20 and 7 is not a model for a habitual first day church service, but is rather an out-of-the-ordinary gathering that took place in the nighttime and went all night long because Paul the Apostle was leaving the next morning. I believe what happened in Acts 27 through 12 is this. The Christians in Troas knew the Apostle was leaving them the next morning, so they organized a fellowship meal the night before his departure and discussed the Scriptures with Paul all night long. It would be similar to something we do around our congregation after the Fall Feast of Tabernacles. Well, after the Sabbath service at the close of the feast, several of us are accustomed to going out to eat in the evening, which is the first day of the week, knowing that we'll all be parting ways the next morning. We break bread, that is, eat together. We discuss Scripture, and oftentimes stay up late doing so. And I think that this is a modern day example in our congregation of what was going on in Acts 20, 7 through 12.